Good afternoon. My name is Lee Shawn Nelson, and welcome to the Offshoot. Today, I have a conversation with a man that I have had many conversations with before in the past, a man whom I consider to be a very, very wise and smart individual who has a lot of insight that I think that you would find also insightful. My guest today is Reverend Hagler. Welcome, Reverend. How are you doing today?
I am doing well, thank you. It's good to be here, and it's good to see you, Brother Nelson.
Thank you. Thank you. So tell us a little bit about yourself first before we dive into this subject of how do we advocate, how do we examine for making African Americans and Native Americans a protected class of people. So give us your background and then we'll dive into some of those questions.
Sure. I was born and raised in Baltimore, Maryland. And from there went to school at, when I left Baltimore, went to school at Hampton Institute, it was called then, now Hampton University. Then I went to Oberlin College in Oberlin, Ohio. And then from Oberlin College to the Chicago Theological Seminary in Chicago, Illinois on the South Side. Was ordained in Chicago in 1980. In fact, on February 3rd, 1980 is the anniversary date of my ordination. It's coming up in a couple of days.
The anniversary.
That's right. And I've been at Plymouth Congregational United Church of Christ here in Washington, D.C. since 1992, September 1992. So that's going on 30 years. And was in Boston, Roxbury, Massachusetts before that, in the midst of a whole lot of racial unrest that we organized around and dealt with police stop and search and police violence up there as well. So it's been a lifelong adventure dealing with these kinds of issues in my ministry and my work.
Hence the reason why I wanted to speak with you. And of course, I've gone to your church and listened to a couple of sermons, but your church is also a historically Black church here in DC, correct?
Yeah, we were founded in 1881, a Black congregation. In fact, for anyone who knows the geography of DC, it was founded, its first building was at 17th and P Street, Northwest, which was right outside of DuPont Circle. And a big part of the Black community was right outside of DuPont Circle. In fact, that area was Black coming out of Foggy Bottom. And so a lot of you go down there today, there is no hint that a Black community really ever existed there. I think a CVS store sits where the church used to sit.
Really? That CVS store right there on the corner of P and 17th Street?
That's correct. And
wow.
We moved to Plymouth on the corner of North Capitol and Riggs Road, Northeast in 1961, because basically the changing fair housing, et cetera, opened up neighborhoods and Black people moved out into places like this, and so did Plymouth. And so I've been on this corner ever since 1961.
Outstanding, outstanding. So you definitely have the credibility to talk about this issue and many other issues.
I hope so.
I think that you do. So let's get right into it. So again, you mentioned your history and you have dove into issues regarding race and what have you. So let's focus specifically on Black Americans and Native Americans. Okay, a lot has happened over the last few years, and it seems like even though there are laws in place in terms of discrimination, et cetera, there still seems to be a lack of some things that prevent some people from acting on their beliefs, false or not, when it comes to the Black community or Native Americans. And I'm wondering, is there something that can be done from your perspective to ensure that Black Americans today and future generations could be protected from a small segment of the population that believes in supremacy or in the workplace, or as you know, a lot of churches today are still divided. Do you believe that there should be a protection for Black Americans and Native Americans?
Well, I think that, to some degree, we can look to the Native, the indigenous communities that received some protections from the federal government, were in many places given sovereignty over the land, et cetera, et cetera. But the problem being is that the poverty rates are high, the mortality rates are high,
Okay.
rates of disease are high, the rates of illiteracy are high, rates of poverty are high. Because in a sense, once you do that, you're basically surrendering to the dominant class, because you give them now the ability to define what those protections are and what those protections look like. Well, if we believe that racism and white supremacy is an individual affair, then that could work. But it's not an individual affair, it is a collective affair. The country was built on the building blocks of white supremacy. White supremacy continues to feed the country, no matter how liberal someone wants to claim that they are. The fact is, just look around. Whites who are liberal live in white neighborhoods, and they send their kids, if they can help it, to white schools.
Mm-hmm.
And their entire social gathering is white. Their economic alliances are white. I mean, so no matter how liberal someone is, the fact is that it is a system that is built on white supremacy and still continues to be segregated at many, many different levels, down to the point where you hear in the current debate of whether a Black woman should go on the Supreme Court. It would be about time, but immediately we know that so many white people are going to say, well, he shouldn't have said that they were going to be a Black woman, because now we know she's there because of affirmative action.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Well, every white person in America is in the place that they are because of white affirmative action. Just think about it. The structure is geared towards their privilege.
So you're saying basically that for the start of this country, white men in particular, and white people in general, but particularly white men, have always benefited from some form of affirmative action.
Always. You know, I always joke and call it the Forrest Gump reality of life.
Mm-hmm.
You remember that movie?
I do.
Right. So here you got Forrest Gump, right? Don't know anything from anything.
Mm-hmm.
Right, but he's a medal winner. He becomes a rich man. Even the Black man gets killed in Vietnam, and he takes over the shrimp business and turn.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. Yeah.
Affirmative action.
It certainly is. I do have to say that as a journalist, that's something that I always felt deep down, especially when I was the only Black person in the newsroom, and as I saw certain things happened in the newsroom, but wasn't able to speak to, but I certainly understand that. But let me ask you a question regarding your take on Native Americans and where they are right now. You say that those protections basically were put in place by white men, the government. What do you think about protections that were put in place, or that were put in place by Native Americans, in that they created their protections, as opposed to the protections being dictated to them from a place of supremacy?
If they had the full power to govern themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Now I've been on places like in Wyoming,
mm-hmm.
Where you had historical enemies put on the same reservation by the government in hopes that folks would kill each other.
Interesting. I did not know that.
I mean, so I'm suspicious whenever a dominant class can decide what are the protections. And the reality is, unless we really truly move into a separate state, a separate governance system,
okay,
right, with separate laws and separate law enforcement, we will never be protected by a dominant class. We only can protect ourselves.
So do you think that's something that Black Americans should learn from Native Americans?
Well, no, because the reality is that there's not really, I mean, there's people talk about independence, but if you're Native and you're a reservation, you're under the Department of the Interior.
That's what you're saying. So basically, let me ask you something then. So last year in Oklahoma, as you may be aware, Native Americans there, the Native Americans, I guess, were Cherokee and the Creek Indians, if you will, they were given basically governance of some territories in, I guess that's eastern part of Oklahoma, where they can decide who, when it comes to, I guess, criminal cases, if a person committed a crime, they would go through the chiefs of that nation versus going through a U.S. government court system. So that's not the kind of protections you're talking about, or is it something more detailed and elaborate than that?
I don't know if you ever, there's a, let me say it this way. I like to look at sometimes old movies. There was an old movie called Burn, B-U-R-N, if anybody ever saw it, with Marlon Brando in it. It was about a slave uprising in a fictitious island in the Caribbean. And Marlon Brando is sent down by the British government to basically destabilize the country so that the British can take it over from the Portuguese. And the way he determines to take it over from the Portuguese is by helping to start a slave rebellion. And the guy who's a part of the slave rebellion, who's the leader of the slave rebellion, is captured. And Brando has this prang of conscience and goes and he cuts his rope and he says, leave, you're free to go. And he says, if a man can set you free, then you ain't free at all.
That's very profound. I'm gonna have to look for that movie.
Right. And what I'm getting at in this is that what gives folk the right to give to us the ability to legislate, the ability to try, right? Mm-hmm. Because if you give it to it, you can take it back.
I agree with that. So what do you think should be some of the ideas that should be brought to the forefront for us to discuss in terms of how do we advocate for making Black Americans, African Americans, and Native Americans a protected class of people based on what we put in place in terms of the protections, what we want in terms of protections?
I mean, I think that what we have to continue to do, because I don't think there's any protection for any of us in the current context of the United States of America.
Okay.
Right. We saw how easy it is to go backwards. We saw how easy it is for white supremacy to have its resurgence in a very public way. We've seen all that.
And of course, you're referring to the most recent incidents like the January 6th attack on the US Capitol, the last 4 years of the presidency of Donald Trump. I'm assuming that's what you're referring to.
Sure, which is all a reaction to a Black person going to the White House. Mm-hmm. So you have a Black person that goes to the highest office in the land, and the response is that white folks go crazy. Mm-hmm. As if we sent a Black Panther to the White House. Nothing could be further from the truth, because he adequately fitted within the white paradigm. But still, it drove white folks crazy.
Yes.
Right? Because that was not supposed to happen in America. That people of color are under the generosity of white folks. And you should be happy with what they do. So our issue is this. I don't think there's any easy solution. I think the issue is that, one, we got to become aware and awake. We got to know what the real history of ourselves and of this country. We got to be able to use that history to organize and to continue to organize block by block. We got to put people in local offices. I don't care if it's dog catcher, elect folks in the office that got a racial analysis, that understand what racism and white supremacy is in America. You see, one of the things that happened right after Reconstruction that really brought Reconstruction to an end in 1876 was that when they enforced one person, one vote immediately after enslavement, 2,000 men, Black men, were elected to office. Yes. 2,000. Mm-hmm. Right? That's when white folks said enough is enough, and they began to launch their machineries of terrorism.
And most of those elections were Black men in the South.
In the South. Why? Because you had imported more Black folks as slaves in the South than you had white folks. And when you enforce one person, one vote, the fact is that the Black vote overwhelmed the white vote.
Yes, I like to give the example of Wilmington, North Carolina. which at one point was the most prosperous city for Black people in the country. I will argue more so than Greenwood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, what we know as Black Wall Street. But Wilmington, North Carolina, as you say, after Reconstruction was doing quite well. And the Black leaders in that city also had some white allies. But as you mentioned, white supremacy had an issue with that, and they literally burned down the city. And it's in recent years that the city of North Carolina and the state recognized the death of all those Black people in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898.
Mhm.
It's an untold story that should be spread around the world.
But you stated, and you stated very well, but I'd add one more piece to it. Because they carried out an armed coup d'etat, they elected a town council and a mayor that was a fusion government made of Black folks and white folks. And they killed the town council, murdered them, and installed a new white government the next morning, and had a list of Black troublemakers in North Carolina that needed to get on the train and leave North Carolina and never return again. And they put them on the train like cattle. And the train took them out of North Carolina. That's part of the history that nobody ever talks about. 1898, and you hit it precisely. This stuff had been going on every time there was an economic breakout or economic stability or an economic oasis for Black folks, because you had a newspaper there, a Black newspaper. You had a sit-down restaurant there for Black for the town that was owned by Black folks, right? Had all that stuff going on in Wilmington, North Carolina, right up against the Cape Fear River. And and the fact is that basically it was a group that called themselves, I think it was the Redcoats, which was a Klan group. But they called themselves the Red Shirts. The Red Shirts. There were Klan groups that basically had organized to basically take the state back and take the city back, and so that's a part of, and they did. That's at the point of a gun. So January 6th is familiar. Everybody's acting like it's an aberration. It's not an aberration. Right. And when I talk about 1876, that's the Tilden Hayes election. That was fought into a constitutional crisis, had to go into Congress to be decided and to be negotiated on. Mm-hmm. Finally, the negotiation was that Hayes could assume the presidency of the United States, but in turn, he was going to remove the last remaining Union troops from the South. And that was the death of Reconstruction. And that was the beginning, the real beginning of Jim Crow.
Wow, very, very interesting.
So that's what they wanted to do on January 6th, was to create a constitutional crisis and throw it into Congress to decide.
Yeah, which is troubling in so many ways. I want to go back to what you were saying about we need to be aware and awake before we can start coming up with protections for ourselves. Can you give me an example or two what we need to be more aware of? You did mention like our history and what have you, but can you give me another example?
Well, I think a part of the whole example around the history is people dance away from really taking a critical look, for example, at the 1960s.
Okay.
The 1960s was a moment of reawakening in America. Civil rights, Black empowerment, Chicano groups, Puerto Rican groups, all emerging and doing their self-identity, deciding that nobody else could identify them and tell them their history except them. That was part of what, the Black Panthers, the Young Lords, that were, all these different groups that were operating all over. The emergence of the American Indian movement, in terms of its militancy, where people were really saying, we are going to define ourselves, we're going to maintain our narrative, tell our history, and we're going to stand up against the system when and where it's necessary. That's what was going on.
Yeah.
Right. And then I really believe this, the federal government starts pumping drugs in the community. And Vietnam starts killing off people from the community.
No coincidence.
Right. And so, and it's just like bringing blankets into Indian villages that are infected with smallpox.
Which is this country's history with Native Americans.
That's why I'm saying they can't protect us. We got to protect it. And so part of it is getting back to that history instead of poo-pooing that history. Because one thing that folks have gotten very conditioned at is to dance over that history and not really analyze what was going on, mm-hmm. not only in America, but around the world. Mm. What was going on in Africa, what was going on in Latin America, what was going on in the Caribbean, what was going on in North America. There was a total uprising that was taking place. What was going on in Vietnam.
Do you think what happens here in this country in terms of a movement with Black Americans is what leads to movements around the globe? Is what happens here, if it starts here, is that the catalyst that brings about or could bring about change, if you will, in terms of people and communities around the world coming up with their own protections, if you will? Does it start here with the community in America, the Black community here in America?
I think there's an interdependency. One thing that King writes in his book, Why We Can't Wait, I think it's Why We Can't Wait, is he talks about with and as a journalist, I'm going right back to you, he says as television and television news became commonplace, and in every living room all across America, people were seeing on the news Africa throwing off the chains of colonialism, mm-hmm. right? What was going on in Southeast Asia, where people were struggling against the French for independence. And so they saw brown and Black faces struggling for liberation, like Patrice Lumumba. And Black folks asked themselves, why not us? So there is this interdependency as people see it, because people surely also overseas borrowed from the movement that emerged here. But if we're going to take King accurately at what he's saying, that somehow that what was going on over there sparked the imagination of what could happen here. Mm. And then what happened here became a catalyst for folks moving their movement forward over there. Mm. So that's why I said there's an interdependency.
Yes.
Just think about it. It's like we don't really have news in America. Just think about what passes as news.
Yes, it's gone way downhill.
We hear nothing about the world unless there's a major flood, a hurricane, or earthquake, or war. We don't hear about what's going on in Turkey and what's going on in Ghana, or what's going on in Zambia, or what. We don't hear that. We don't even know. If you look at the news, those places might as well not exist.
Well, on top of that, there also seems to be some disagreement in terms of what is going on in those other places. I mean, there is disagreement right now in terms of what's actually happening in Ethiopia with Tigray and Eritrea. Some say that there is no conflict. Some say that there is a conflict. Some say that there is genocide. Some say there is no genocide. So who did you believe? I mean, is the media doing us an injustice by not giving us real reporting?
Oh, they definitely are, but they also discovered that if you can cut off and you can control information, you can control the imagination of people. Mm. And so if you don't want people to engage in revolutionary cause, in cause of actual social change, you want to cut off the images of social change that may be happening and going on elsewhere, because you do not want to spark the imagination. It was like Denmark Vesey organizing out of what became Mother Emanuel Church in South Carolina.
Yep, Charleston. Mm-hmm.
Charleston. hears of what had taken place in Haiti, sparked the imagination.
Yeah.
Because you got to remember, all the folks who could get out of Haiti with their slaves got out of Haiti with their slaves and came south to places like Louisiana and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, those slaves brought the information of what had happened.
Yes.
Right? They said, the white folks got their butt kicked by a bunch of slaves.
Yeah.
Right? That starts the imagination.
It does. And that's another part of world history I think that most of us don't know about and that we should learn about, because like you said, I think one reason why Haiti is where it is today economically is because people failed to realize that after that revolt in Haiti, the United States, along with France, led a global embargo against Haiti. They wouldn't allow any other country to deliver supplies to Haiti, or they wouldn't allow Haiti to export anything to other parts of the world. And that led to the economic downfall of Haiti, which of course, where the country is right now, is having a hard time to recover from that downfall that was led by the United States and France.
Sure,
But,
that's right.
But I want to ask you something though,
but let me add another little footnote to that, Brother Nelson.
Mm-hmm.
Because the irony was that they levied a bill against Haiti for the slaves that had gotten freed.
I did not know that part.
Right? They ran a calculation and say, we lost this amount in terms of income, in terms of monetary value in slaves, and therefore you're going to pay it.
Interesting.
I mean, just an amazing, dehumanizing aspect to the history, and the United States is going to back them up in that?
Yeah. Incredible. So where we are today, then, you mentioned social change, but do we have anyone today that could lead that change, or do we need a leader to lead that change, or do we all have to do our small individual parts and eventually work as a collective to bring about that change? How do we bring about these changes that could lead to the protections that many of us believe and feel are needed?
Well, one of the things is that we need some political visioning. Every movement needs political visioning. We don't have political visioning. One thing that I've been critical about the church is the church should be the grassroots place of political visioning. To talk about things in the way in which it needs to be talked about, white supremacy in the way that it needs to be talked about. Talk about the structure of the system so that people can gain a vision, because without a vision, the people shall perish.
Yeah.
And part of that is we got to create the sort of the political analysis for when people move forth in the world, move forth into society, they're not seduced by the systems of oppression.
Mm-hmm.
Just like that song says, drunk with the wine of the world, we forget thee.
Yeah.
And that's part of the problem. That we get drunk with the wine of the world, that we forget who we are, whose we are, and we forget where we came from, and we forget the cauldron of history that we've been molded and shaped out of.
Yeah, so in other words, remember where you come from, know your roots.
Know your roots. I'm doing a Lenten series, doing Lent on forgetting, on the subject, forgetting to remember. Because that's our problem. We have forgotten to remember. I mean, just think about it. Ask yourself a question. How can any half aware, or let me put it this way, half asleep Black person can sit on a stage behind Donald Trump?
Oh, you really don't want to get me started on that one.
I'm just saying. I mean, that just shows you a part of the malaise. The fact is that Donald Trump got more Black male votes than he did in the first election.
What's ironic about that to me is also Black men in general notoriously don't vote. So I can remember in the last election, Black men complaining about the lack of candidates on the Democratic side and et cetera and so forth. But yet a lot of Black men do not vote. And that's just a fact. Black women lead the vote for Black Americans. And I was just out Sunday canvassing my neighborhood in Northeast DC, asking people to get involved. And I came across some young Black men and I asked them, would you be voting in the upcoming election, November 2022? They both said, we do not vote. I took them for their word, but that is a big issue. And I don't know how to change that. But maybe, I think you're right, maybe vision, and maybe the church has to get back to getting people to see that vision.
I mean, part of it is that we ask for people to vote and to put people in the office to protect a system that does not have our best interests at heart. Just think about that.
Yeah.
How crazy that sounds. Rather than to elect change agents who go to office hell-bent on tearing up the structure. So not worried about getting reelected.
Yes.
It's sort of like, no, you got me here now. Now you're going to deal. Right? That's what we don't do. That's what we don't, because we don't have the political vision. We are engaged in their structure. I always tell this story. The day I was born, which was in 1954, so y'all can figure out what damn book was born when I tell you. In 1954, when I was born, 4 people, I think. One was a woman named Lolita LeBron, went into the House of Representatives, and I think they shot 5 congresspeople on that day. That comes out of the United States that wanted to try to deal with the issue of Puerto Rico once and for all, had them put on the ballot of whether Puerto Rico was to be independent or a colony. And a Black man led the independence movement, Don Abiso Campos. And the country voted for independence. And the United States said, hell no, that's not what we meant. Disregarded the election. And Don Abiso Campos said, okay, now America has declared war on us. And therefore we're going to declare war on them. That's what went on that day in 1954.
Wow.
Right. So it's a part of knowing this history.
Yes. That's a very, very interesting story. I'm going to have to go back and definitely look into that one. That sounds right up my alley.
I mean, this stuff is sort of comes at us. But see, if you got to put it down, you can't have people thinking about that. You can't have people identify with that. You can't have people identify with the Black Panthers. You can't have people identify with the Young Lords. You cannot have people identifying with any of the kind of political movements like the American Indian movement. You can't have folks identifying with those stuff. So you got to make those things outlandish. Oh no, I'm not a part of that. Right? In order to try to get control over the narrative, and then you stop people from thinking. You know, one thing Claude, what's his name? Glaude, in his book, Eddie Glaude, in one of his books, he says, the issue with us, I think it's democracy in Black. He says that basically they have destroyed our imagination so that we only can think in terms of Democrat and Republican.
Yes. Yes. This country had various parties in the very, very beginning.
At various parties, but that's all. But they said, we're going to get it down to this because we can't have all this stuff going on. And in most places, I know in Washington, D.C., if you're registered as an independent, you can't vote in the primaries.
Correct.
Right? And once the primaries have decided, that's who's going to get elected. The election's over.
Yes.
So you have disenfranchised anybody who calls themselves independent that want to weigh the different candidates out there, regardless of their party.
Yes, it really is something that I think that should be addressed here in Washington, because again, we're not a state, but most people don't know that. And most people don't know that that this is how DC government works. And on top of that, we do have the old school versus the new school. You know, I'm running for commissioner, you know, here in my ward. And I'm running because many of my neighbors have asked me to run for commissioner. But I'm already running against the old school DC politics because they want to maintain the status quo, versus someone like myself who wants to be that change agent. And I'm determined to be a change agent in any kind of small way that I possibly can. But I do hope that what you're saying gets out there to the masses, because I do believe that you are correct in terms of history, and we need to know the history, and we need to start actually doing a deep dive into who we decide to put into office. Because if they're going to maintain the status quo and not be radical, if you will, in terms of helping our communities, Black Americans, Native Americans, Latino Americans, come up with some kind of protections, then what's the point?
Right. I mean, the issue is that we got to have different kind of voices that project and present issues in a different kind of way.
I agree. And that's basically the root of this podcast, is to have different voices, because I know that not everyone is going to be on the same page, and I want to hear from all kinds of voices. And I do hope that you can come back and continue this discussion again in the future, because there's so much more that we can discuss. And you've already given me my homework for the next week. And so I do want to continue this conversation. So, but before we end this conversation, is there anything you want to add that people should take away from this conversation?
I want to add this, because I preach about this when I go to different churches, because I always come around to this subject. People buy into narrative without thinking about what they've bought into. So the commercial media may just mention the same line over and over and over again, and then people mindlessly walk off and they use that same language and never even analyze what they're saying. Mm-hmm. I always say this: no Black person can historically and factually be a conservative. Think about it. The root of the word is to conserve.
Yes.
What in the hell are we conserving?
I know exactly where you're going with this. Yes.
I mean, we've had to kick down every door to get someplace. We had to crash somebody else's party to make a way for ourselves. We've had to fight to get into schools. We've had to fight to get into neighborhoods. We've had to fight even just to exist. There's nothing that we've conserved. We have broken down every door. So how in the hell can a Black person ever define themselves as a conservative? That's white people's language. And we bought into white people's language. And it's now time for us to shed that skin like a snake sheds its skin.
And on that note, again, Reverend Hagler, I thank you so much for joining me on the Offshoot. And I do look forward to seeing you again very, very, very soon.
Bless you.
Bless you. Have a good day.
Take care.